As I say, I'm Jeffrey Lewis, and I'm the director of the Nuclear Strategy and Nonproliferation Initiative here at the New America Foundation. Our project is essentially a twofold mission. One, to talk about changes to U.S. nuclear strategy that could be made on a bipartisan basis, changes that would be sensible in their own merit and improve U.S. security, with a goal that those changes could then be used as part of a broader campaign to enhance U.S. nonproliferation policy. And so we have a deep and abiding interest in not just the policy decisions, but all of the things that factor in, including U.S. intelligence capabilities. And that's why we're here this morning. We are extremely fortunate to have Bob Drogin, who is the national security correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, and the author of the very excellent book, Curveball, which you can buy a copy of outside. This is, without a doubt, my favorite book of the year, and I think probably one of the finest books ever written about intelligence, because it reads like a spy novel, which I think is really quite remarkable. It's seldom that analytic tradecraft and the process of sort of collecting information can be gripping, but in a sort of very depressing way, I suppose, because this is a story where everything goes wrong. I think it's required reading if you care about nonproliferation, if you care about U.S. policymaking, if you care about intelligence. Bob Drogin is excellently qualified to write this book. He previously served as foreign correspondent for the Times in Asia and Africa, and as a national correspondent based in New York, and has won or shared multiple journalism awards, including the Pulitzer Prize, the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award, and the George Polk Award. And so I hope you will all join me in giving Bob Drogin a warm welcome.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for that effusive and very kind welcome, and thank you very much for attending. I'm honored to be here today at the New America Foundation. Let me start. I think Curveball, the reason I wrote this book, I think Curveball is the defining story of how we went down the rabbit hole in Iraq. It's obviously not the only reason, he's not the only cause of the bad intelligence, but when you deconstruct the story, you realize that more and more of what happened there really hangs on the shoulders of the misunderstandings that stemmed from this one extraordinary case. Sorry, I'm reaching for my glasses here. Too many pockets. He was an Iraqi engineer. He was a chemical engineer who defected to Germany in 1999. And when he got there, he proceeded to tell them a story that essentially they already believed, and so it met very willing ears, which was that he had worked on a program to build vehicles that could spew out, that could produce biological agents, anthrax, botulinum toxin, various other deadly agents. And by putting them on vehicles, they could evade detection and travel around the country. And he said they had done this in a very sophisticated manner using spray dryers and basically giving them the ability to create these agents with the sophistication of that you could use in an anthrax, sorry, in an inhaler you would use for asthma or something. So it was really quite a terrifying story that he was spinning. He was telling this to the Germans he came out in 1999, in 2000 and 2001. His interviews, for the most part, stopped in the late summer, or in September of 2001, prior to the 9/11 attacks. And at the time, that information, as it was being passed to the United States, to the U.S. intelligence community, to the British, to the Israelis in particular, those three are the closest to the Germans here, the information was being viewed as an additional piece of a puzzle, but not by any means a defining one. So if you go back and you look at the CIA estimates and the threat assessments that were being given to Congress during that period of time in 2000, 2001, Saddam was still very much in the he could have, he might have, he possibly has, he may someday category. 3 weeks after 9/11, this information was taken out of a safe. It was re-examined in the climate that we all remember from the 9/11 period. And for the very first time, within the CIA, the Weapons Intelligence Non-Proliferation Center, known as WINPAC, began to hype their estimate. And suddenly Saddam, quote, has weapons of mass destruction, and in particular has these biological agents. And over the next year, that threat began to grow considerably, even though the basic information had not. The way I look at this was in the after excuse me, after 9/11, as you recall, the criticism was that the U.S. intelligence and law enforcement community had, quote, failed to connect the dots. In Curveball, what was happening was they were making up the dots. During the interrogations, during the interviews of Curveball was his code name, the Germans were feeding him information, giving him books, engineering books. He was going online onto the internet. He was making phone calls back to Baghdad to former colleagues of his, and his story began to take on a life of its own. And in the end, of course, they conjured up a weapons system that had never existed. This story is through 2002, in that period in the run-up to the war, as it grew more and more frightening, there was an attempt within the CIA from the clandestine service, people from the European division, who were raising red flags. And it wasn't that they were saying, we know Curveball is a fabricator. That was not the argument. It was much more, we have real concerns here. This man has not been vetted. We have never talked to him. We don't know. We cannot confirm this information. And we're getting warnings from the Germans that they have not confirmed it. And he may be a fabricator. There's a real problem here. A lot of the information he's giving us doesn't add up. Within that battle, it pitted them against the people at WINPAC, at the Weapons Intelligence Center, the analysts. And as the battle rose up the chain of command through the ranks of the CIA, basically the analysts won out. Now, there's some debate as to whether or not the analysts were simply seeing what they wanted to see here. I honestly believe that that part of this was the climate at the time and the assumption that Saddam had these weapons and a willing suspension of disbelief that even if he doesn't have this particular thing, well, when we get to Baghdad, we're going to find something and people will forget the problems. But more broadly, I think some of you probably know, there's the then Deputy Director of the CIA, John McLaughlin, who's an amateur magician in his spare time. And in fact, his nickname was Merlin. And John says that magic is a metaphor for intelligence, is the way he views it. And he's got, instead of pictures of magazine covers, he has pictures of Houdini on his wall. And he has said that it's a metaphor for intelligence because in intelligence, you can't always believe what you see. And I have another character in my book, a very senior German intelligence authority official who is a student of Max Weber, the 19th century German sociologist, and his theories on rationalizing behavior. And he constantly talks about Weber's theory, people hear what they want to hear. And Curveball sort of fits in between that. You can't always believe what you see, and people hear what you want to hear. And in this case, he was a con man. He was telling lies. He was spinning this story. But the CIA willingly conned itself here. It heard what it wanted to hear. It saw what it wanted to see. And it gave the White House what it wanted to know. So by the time we get up to January of 2003, when the president is delivering his State of the Union speech, we all remember that speech because that was when he gave his famous 16 words on uranium from Africa. We have learned from the British government that Iraq has recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa, which they subsequently had to back down on. But when I look at that speech, the most significant words were, we have eyewitness reports of that Saddam has built biological weapons facilities. And he went on over that in that speech and in his subsequent comments over the next week or so. So it was coming at, and that was all from Curveball. And then, of course, a week later, Colin Powell goes up to the CIA. He's been asked by the president to go make the case for war at the United Nations. We're coming up to the 5th anniversary of that next February, to go up to the UN Security Council and make America's best case. So he goes to the CIA. He goes out to Langley, and he spends 4 days out there vetting the intelligence. And the vice president's office has given him a 48-page document with single-spaced document, apparently, with all kinds of what he described later to me as just unsubstantiated rumors and background information and wild allegations, and a lot of this linking Saddam to 9/11 and Saddam to Osama bin Laden and Saddam to al-Qaeda, as well as a lot of wild stories about his various weapons of mass destruction program. And after a day of this, they literally throw this draft in the trash. And Powell turns to Tenet, George Tenet, the DCI at the time, and says, look, I just want what you guys have. Give me your best stuff. And they go back to a document. We all know, I'm sure everybody in this room, what a national intelligence estimate is. It is the considered judgment. It is the gold standard of the U.S. Intelligence Committee. The front page of today's newspaper is filled with the latest NIE on Iran, which we can talk about. The NIE on Iraq, which was done in the fall of 2002, if you saw in today's paper, this latest NIE in Iran took over a year to produce, close to 18 months, I think was one estimate, but certainly over a year. They did the NIE on Iraq in 19 days. And that document, when it was finally declassified, the biological weapons portion is by far the most assertive and by far the most frightening, because it states without any qualifications whatsoever, we have high confidence that Saddam has biological weapons. It proceeds to name another number of them. It says it's larger, the program is larger, more robust, more sophisticated, and more dangerous than it was before the Persian Gulf War, when, in fact, he did have a program back before 1991. How they got to that conclusion, in part, was they looked at some of the information that Curveball had given them. Curveball had said he had worked on this at one facility and on one truck, but he had heard of 6 other trucks. So they said, okay, so there are 7 of these things. So if we multiply what we think maybe one of his trucks might have done times the 7 trucks that he says he's heard about, and we multiply that times 6 months, if you run them nonstop for 6 months. Now, anybody who's been to Iraq knows nothing runs for nonstop for 6 months in Iraq. But they come up with this number that gets them to a higher number than they knew that Saddam had before the first Gulf War. It was what at the agency is known as a WAG, a wild-ass guess. But this was the figure that was being used at this point. When they get to, Colin Powell is out at the CIA. He's being given this information, and he says, I want absolutely your best stuff. And they give him the Curveball material, and they say, this is absolutely incontrovertible. We have no doubts about this. And repeatedly he asks for that. And so he makes that the centerpiece of his speech. And as you recall, when he sat there at the table, and he held up a small beaker full of salt or sugar or whatever it was, and said this much anthrax could kill tens of thousands of people, and behind him were these enormous drawings. Powell later called them cartoons of vehicles that he said, we have an eyewitness who has worked on these. He knows what they have produced. He was an eyewitness. He was there when 12 people were killed in a biological accident. That's all Curveball. That's all his information. The pictures, however, were sort of Curveball's information had gone from between mistranslations and misjudgments and miscommunications and misinterpretations and just flat mistakes. His information had morphed, like through a children's game of telephone. But the drawings are fascinating because essentially you had, as it was told to me, artists in the CIA basement making drawings based on Arabic to German to English translations of interviews that were never transcribed, simply put in a analysis form that were then passed through a series of agencies, reanalyzed, reformatted, and whatnot, until you get these trucks up there that Colin Powell says we have an eyewitness, but in fact they never existed. The entire thing was a farce. Now, my view is Curveball was a con man here. I mean, and his motive, curiously, was not to start a war, was not to overthrow Saddam Hussein. He was trying to get asylum in Germany. He was trying to get a job. He was trying to get a Mercedes-Benz. He's a modest man. He's a schlub. I mean, he was a taxi driver. We now know he was, in fact, he did work for a program that he said, like any good liar, he based his story on a very strong kernel of truth. He was relying on the internet to get further information, going back to old UN weapons inspectors' reports from the 1990s. A lot of this detail was in there. He was, the Germans were filling in gaps for him, as they described it to me. Other people along the line were making excuses for him. There was such a belief that these weapons existed that within the CIA, contradictory evidence they found excuses to rationalize it. A good example of it is, not the only one by any means, by Curveball's description, these vehicles, he said he had worked at a facility known as Jerf al-Nadaf. It's a warehouse facility about 15 miles south of Baghdad. And because of the configuration of the buildings, he said the trucks had to sort of make this dogleg turn this way and then come up this way into the building and come out that way of the other building. And the satellite, the satellite pictures sort of showed that would have been the case. But except that in 1997, a wall appeared. A 6-foot-high concrete block wall appeared that blocked the trucks the way he said they had occurred. Now, he had claimed he'd been working there all this time. Well, rather than suggest or question whether the wall meant that Curveball's information was wrong or that he was a liar, they said, well, Saddam built the wall to deceive the satellites, or, well, there must be a secret gate in this wall, or, well, Saddam, they knocked the wall down at night and they rebuilt it in the daytime to trick us all. Similarly, because so many of the defectors who came out from Iraq were, I think of them like Zelig. They came out and they said, yeah, I was Saddam's best friend, and I went to Salman Pak, and I went to Tuwaitha, and I went to Fallujah, and I went to here, and I can tell you all about his chemical programs and all about his biological programs, and and I helped him build a nuclear weapon, blah blah blah. And so there's all this stuff coming out from people, and anyone who knew about Iraq knew this was crazy, right? It's a very compartmented, very rigidly run government with very compartmented information. These are the most secret, sensitive parts of Iraq's weapons program. We now know, even his own ministers knew very little about what was going on. It was also closely held, and these people would come out and all claim to have this information. And Curveball's information, ironically, was the opposite, which is one of the reasons he was so credible. He claimed a very core knowledge about a very specific program, but he said, I worked on it. I was the guy who did it. And that gave him, and he said, I'm a chemical engineer. I really don't know about biology. And so they said, oh, well, if they were really trying to trick us here, he'd be a biological engineer, right? And at a certain point, the belief that defectors lie is so ingrained in the understanding of the intelligence because of this Zelig-like phenomena that I described. At a certain point, Curveball, after he got his asylum, began to reel his story back in and said, well, I really wasn't the project manager. I was just a trainee engineer, and I wasn't the. I really don't know if it was producing anthrax. All they talked about was product A and product B and product C, and I didn't actually operate the trucks. I just heard they were being operated, and his story began to get very amorphous. And rather than saying, "My God, this case is crumbling in front of us," they said, "Well, since everybody else lies to exaggerate their story, because that's the coin of the realm if you're a defector, this guy's pulling it back in, it gives him more credibility." So it's sort of this case was falling apart even as they were handing it off. The most important part of this, obviously, is that when President of the United States is citing Curveball to the country in the State of the Union speech, when Colin Powell is quoting the same eyewitness to the world as part of his UN Security Council speech, the CIA, the U.S. intelligence, had never interviewed this man, had never met this man, didn't even know his name. All of this information had been passed to them by another spy service, by another intelligence agency, the Germans in this case. It had gone through all of these changes so that, in fact, the mistranslations and misinterpretations of it had morphed so that even when Powell was speaking, what he was saying was not, in fact, the lies that Curveball had given in the first place. In retrospect, and we are coming up to the 5th anniversary, and you go back and you look at Powell's speech, and it's really quite startling how, and I was there that day, I won't say how gullible, but how we were all, I at least felt swept up in this, in this fear that was being engendered by the administration. And you go back and you look at what Powell was showing, even with those cartoons I was describing in his speech that day, and he said, these trucks could only operate from Thursday night until Friday because that was the Muslim holy day, and the inspectors wouldn't come to visit. And he showed these pictures of these trucks with canvas sides. Well, it didn't take a lot to figure out that you can't brew anthrax from Thursday night until Friday. I mean, it takes several days. It's a lengthy process. It's not like making a martini or something. And in fact, the United States and the Soviet Union had built vehicles of their own in the early days of the Cold War. But these were sophisticated, high biocontainment systems, self-enclosed units that were being used at the time in fear of this. As you all know, the United States gave up offensive biological weapons under Richard Nixon. But we'd had some experience with this. But they were very sophisticated. They were enclosed vehicles. There was containment systems. There was decontamination systems, whatnot. And he's got these things up there with canvas-sided trucks. Now, anybody again who's been to Iraq, they've got bathtub-sized potholes and gravel roads and goats on the street, and what was supposed to happen to these things as they drove down the road and got into an accident if they were spewing out anthrax. So there was a whole side to that sort of made no sense that day, but it obviously didn't carry through. 3 days after Powell's speech, the UN weapons inspectors in Iraq went to Jerf al-Nadaf, and they tore the place apart. They dug up the floor, they took pictures of the wall, they took pictures of truck tracks out in the mud outside. They did wipes and swipes, and they took DNA tests for every possible biological agent. Nothing. They went to the 6 other places that Curveball had described. Nothing. That information was passed on to Washington and to the British. Had no impact whatsoever. After the war, the Iraq Survey Group investigated the case. I don't want to give away the secrets to this, but one of the I solved the story. I solved the mystery in the book. But one of the things that's fascinating is a couple of characters in there who, one in particular, who's still out at sea. He's now at the Counterterrorism Center. A man named Jerry, who had been one of the great proponents of Curveball's story within the CIA, within WINPAC. He was a self-described true believer, and at a certain point in the post-war investigation, when he became absolutely convinced that, in fact, the story was based on quicksand, that it had entirely fallen apart. They'd talked to the family, to Curveball's family. They had dug up records. They had interrogated all of the people in the chain of command who might know something about this. They had utterly disproved the story. He has virtually a nervous breakdown in Iraq and comes back to Washington, and he's determined to bring truth to power. And they treat him as if he has, a loathsome disease. He goes to work and discovers somebody else is sitting at his desk, and he's been reassigned to the visitor center. Sort of a subtle jab, right? Without access to a classified computer. The Soviets, of course, would send their people off to psychiatric camps, so to speak. He was told to seek, in this case, he was told to seek counseling, that he needed therapy for his problems. When David Kay, many of you know, when David Kay, after he came back with a similar sort of, road to Damascus change of heart in December of 2003, prior to that, he'd had an office down the hall from George Tenet and a parking place in the VIP slot out in front of the CIA executive office building. When he came back this time, and again is basically saying, hey, we've got 85% of the information is done. We've pretty much destroyed this there. We need to deal with this now. His office has been moved on another floor down the end of a hall filled with construction material. He's the only guy down there, no telephone. He doesn't get interviewed. He doesn't get invited to any meetings. He doesn't get anything. And his parking place, instead of being out in the VIP section, it's at the far end of a parking lot that the way he described to me was like Valley Forge. He had to sort of trudge across this mile of snow. So they were very vindictive. It was a sense of they did not welcome people basically calling fault and pointing fingers at this. In the end, the CIA finally was given access to Curveball in March of 2004, 1 year after the invasion. It didn't take very long. They concluded he was indeed a fabricator. It meant they had to reel back in. They issued a burn notice and reel back in hundreds of documents, thousands of pages of reporting that stemmed from his information. To me, it is a story of how otherwise well-meaning people get caught up in a really dreadful case. I find numerous cases along the narrative where, for what I consider to be tawdry bureaucratic reasons, red flags were ignored. Somebody simply saying, that's not my problem, let him worry about it. Or cases where, for ambition, people didn't want to get involved, or because they were willing to say, look, even if this one isn't right, there's got to be, there's so much smoke out there, there must be a fire. When we get to Baghdad, we're going to find trenches full of pointy-ended things with a skull and crossbones sticking on the top of it, and nobody's going to remember these other problems. Well, they were wrong about that, too. I think I've gone on long enough, and I'm happy to answer your questions, and thank you for listening.
Well, I see several questions, but I'm going to take the sort of chair's prerogative to start this off by asking about the most recent Iran NIE, and in particular kind of two questions. The first is, one of the things that I think really comes through in the book for me is the degree to which cooperation with foreign intelligence agencies, in this case specifically with the Germans, can be really quite difficult and fraught with peril if one isn't careful. And there seems to be a lot of indications that some of the earlier evidence that we had about Iran's programs, this sort of laptop of death, came to us via the Germans. And so if you have sort of general thoughts on the German intelligence services as a source of foreign cooperation and what that might tell us about Iran, that would be one thing. And then the second, obviously, is, gee, this new NIE seems like a big change, which, based on the kind of curveball reporting, I'm a little surprised that the NIE would, at least to my mind, so much undercut what's going on. And so if you had any thoughts on that.
Sure. One of the things I became fascinated on and here was the degree of suspicion and distrust between the U.S. and the German intelligence services. And this stemmed back to the early days of the Cold War and a series of seemingly endless series of penetrations of the BND by Soviet bloc forces. And it culminated shortly before Curveball came out, when U.S. intelligence CIA officer bought virtually the entire files from the Stasi, and these were files about Stasi agents in German society, as well as on U.S. bases and U.S. embassies and all kinds of things. Stasi was, as we know, quite successful at what they were at collecting information, and refused to share this for the longest time. George Tenet refused to give it up, and there was a real sense through the 1990s that relations were nosediving between these two agencies. They were expelling CIA officers from Germany. We were wiretapping, eavesdropping in the embassy, got caught at that. There was just sort of this sniping back and forth of stuff. So there's this bad blood that goes between those two agencies to start with. Secondly, just sort of the nature of intelligence. So that was part of what was at issue here when they got Curveball and they said, we've got a really important source. Secondly, on a more sort of human level, the man who was then the head, he's now actually head of the BND, but then he had a different position as sort of a cabinet level officer in charge of intelligence and law enforcement, had been the former chief of police in Hamburg. He'd been a law enforcement officer, then intelligence, but he had been, most recent job was chief of police in Hamburg. And he angrily, bitterly resented the allegations that came out of the Bush administration about the Hamburg cell after 9/11. We all remember that there was quite a lot of reporting being done about the fact that 3 of the 4 pilots of the planes had lived in Hamburg, and it was the Hamburg cell. And his argument was, hey, they lived in America for a lot longer than they lived, after that they had, licenses, they got bank accounts, they got on airplanes, they went to Las Vegas, they did this and that. Why are you blaming us? You guys didn't catch him, and you're sort of all pointing the finger at the Hamburg cell. How come we don't hear about the Newark cell or the San Diego cell or something? So there was a sort of a very personal element to it. And then that you have this broader sense. You remember after 9/11, the issue was the stovepipes, right? The CIA wasn't sharing information with the FBI. They don't play nice in the sandbox. Well, it's true. I mean, and it's even more true for the CIA and other intelligence agencies from other countries. So the fact that the Germans would not, after the war, or after this case first came out, the CIA blamed the Germans for not giving them access to Curveball and saying it was their fault. The fact is that that very rarely happens that they would get access to another service. The CIA would never allow German authorities, for example, to interview a senior, high-level informant, under confidentiality. So that was part of an issue. In terms of Iran, it's fascinating to read this. I'm sure you've all seen the stories this morning. In 2005, the NIE came out and was quite had high confidence that Iran was actively seeking and working towards a nuclear weapon. Today they come out and say the program stopped in 2004. So, all right, so we have a 2002 estimate on Iraq that is certainly on the WMD side of it, the chemical, biological, and nuclear, is wrong in almost every sentence. We now have an NIE in today that says that the NIE of 2005, it's not quite as dramatic as the Iraq one was, but at least in its perspective, which was that they stopped the program. I mean, we know there was in fact a secret program for before that. They now say it's been stopped. So I'm not sure what to make of it. So we're 2 out of 3, or what? I don't know. I mean, to me, the most fascinating part is that obviously there was widespread criticism after Iraq that the agency, if they didn't twist the intelligence to meet the policy, they certainly accepted the policy as the default mechanism, and the intelligence fit that image on the weapons of mass destruction, not on the al-Qaeda side. And on Iran, clearly they have made a deliberate, they've reasserted their independence, which is what they're supposed to do. I mean, there was a reason that the CIA was built across the river, in the woods out there. I mean, they're not supposed to be in an arm of the White House. George Tenet went up to Georgetown in February 5th of 2004, a year after Colin Powell's speech at the UN, and I was there that morning, and one of the things that struck me, it was not in his speech, it was in response to a question. He said, this is pretty close to the quote, he said, "The president gets his intelligence from one person, me. I meet with him 6 days a week." And that's not the way the system is supposed to work. And there are a lot of people who were sort of rankled at that and thought, that in fact is the problem, that there's sort of a coffee clutch over in the Oval Office every morning, and it was distorting the way the intelligence was going. I have an anecdote in my story, in my book, that sort of gets to this, which is after the war, a day after David Kaye has gone up to Congress and said, quote, "We were all wrong about the pre-war intelligence," for which he was just savaged at the CIA. He's invited to have a lunch at the White House in the Oval Office. So he meets there. There's a little dining room off the Oval Office, and he meets there with Bush and President Bush and Vice President Cheney and Condi Rice and Andy Card. And Bush asks him, am I meeting too much with George? And David Kaye gets a little nervous. He's not going to say that. But he starts talking about the PDB, the President's Daily Brief, and he says, it's become sort of like CNN headline service. And if you ask a question, it drives the process instead of the process coming to you unfiltered. And the president turns to Cheney and says, "That's why they're telling me about that son of a bitch in Mozambique." And apparently what had happened was there had been some brief. There was an election going on down in Mozambique, and Chissano, who was a longtime strongman, was running for re-election. And Bush had made some comment, and as a result of which the agency, Tenet picks up the phone. They want to know about Mozambique or whatever it was. And they scramble a guy from the Africa desk, and somebody goes to Maputo, and for the next 6 weeks he's getting daily updates on, the internecine inner workings of, a rather obscure Southeast African nation down there. So, I don't know.
Great. Well, we'll send the microphone out to people to ask questions, but please remember to identify yourself. Start here and then.
Henry Heilbrunn. So how should it work? Are there formal controls that should be in place that aren't in place? You mentioned that the Curveball was accepted because red flags were ignored, smoke signals came up. What should have been done? And is that in place today to have it done?
As Jeffrey kindly pointed out, I've written a spy story that is, and it's not a policy book, so I want to just get that caveat out there. And this is, as I've been traveling around the country, it's only when I get to Washington that people ask questions so, how the system is supposed to work as opposed to who did what. Clearly what happened in a case like this is there need to be greater safeguards, and there needs to be a greater openness and sharing of information. It was clear in the post-war investigations that there was an echo chamber effect caused by the degree of secrecy here. I know, for example, the Israelis in one of their Knesset reports talked about how they would get information, they would share it with the Americans because of what's called the third-party rule, in which the American, in which if I give information to Jeffrey and Jeffrey gives it to you, he can't tell you where I got it from. So what they were saying was they would give it to the Americans, and then they would ask the British, have you heard anything? And the British would have gotten it from the Americans, and it was coming around as corroboration. And there's a lot of that went along. And you can understand from their point of view why you need to maintain the secrecy, but for the analysts within the CIA, that was happening quite a lot, and there was a real issue. One of the changes that they say they have made is that there's a greater transparency, so the analysts know the actual source of information as it's coming in. So they have a greater ability to decide whether this person is believable. One of the odd things, and it's just a small insight, if you will, into how the system worked, was in some of these discussions, the people from the DO side, from the clandestine service, were saying, is he credible? When they asked, is he credible? For them, that was a question about his bona fides. Is he trustworthy? Have we looked at his background? Does he have a track record of providing reliable information? Does he have the access he says he had? Can we prove it? So it's really a very personal thing. For the analysts, the question, is he credible, had to do with the information. Is it plausible? If you connect the pipe to the fermenter to the spray dryer, do you get anthrax at the other end? Is the system work the way he said? So they were sort of talking past each other, and they were not necessarily, so they'd have these conversations about, is he credible or isn't he credible? And the affirmation that was coming in was not meeting the real question. So there needs to be greater transparency, I think, within the system.
Thank you. Dan Hamilton. Two quick questions, if I may. One, you mentioned the NIE on weapons of mass destruction, and that it provided a sort of caveated commentary that Saddam has this capacity. But isn't that exactly where INR objected in the process and made a footnote?
Yeah, they did on the nuclear side. Go ahead. I'm happy to explain. But, yeah.
And to the extent that you think that'd be interesting to explain, please do. The other question I have is, do you think now, looking back, that there has been adequate and sufficient investigation of what happened, particularly from a congressional point of view, not just on Curveball, but in the larger picture?
Let me take the second question first. As you know, that you've had the SISI, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, issued a series of reports. The original ones were quite heavily redacted. A lot of that information subsequently came out through the Rob Silberman Commission, which was appointed by the White House, which initially said it wouldn't do it, just as initially said it wouldn't do a 9/11 commission, and then got forced into it. And that really put quite a lot of information out into public. The Iraq Survey Group, as well, as you know, did the on-the-ground investigation in Iraq and managed to get all of their information declassified, or at least their report declassified as well. The underlying information remains classified. There was a very bitter fight at the Senate Intelligence Committee about getting further reports out by the Democratic minority at the time. And I actually don't know where it stands now that the Democrats are back in charge of the committee. There was a greater attempt at looking, not only on that committee, but through Henry Waxman's committee, at looking at the role of political manipulation, or whether there was political pressure used to generate some of this material. And the problem for me, or not the problem, why I think this story is so frightening is on the issue of Saddam's connections, alleged connections to Osama bin Laden in 9/11, there really was clearly a very politically driven attempt to cherry-pick information. We know about the Office of Special Plans at the Pentagon. We know about other sources, the Chalabi crowd and whatnot, feeding that kind of information. And that was sort of this sort of backdoor effort to get the stuff in. And as I said, when Powell was at the UN, they tried to get, was at the CIA, the White House wanted him to use that, and he said, no, I'm not going to do it. The problem with this is that this really was the official view. This was the stuff that was in the National Intelligence Estimate. This was not some little, birdie whispering in Dick Cheney's ear. This was George Tenet delivering it up to the Oval Office on a silver platter. It was them delivering it to the White House, to the Congress, in a skiff out there, in their NIE. It was the official statements to the public. It was their threat assessments to Congress. So it was really the official version of it. That's why it's, to me, frightening. As to your first question, the reason in retrospect, and of course this wasn't clear at the time, all the post-war investigations concluded that without Curveball's information, they really had no case to make, certainly not anything like the case they made, that Saddam had biological weapons. They had a very mixed bag of a hodgepodge of other defectors, all of whom subsequently also proved to be fabricators, but it didn't add up, and it sort of didn't jibe. He was the defining person. He was the eyewitness that the president quoted and Colin Powell quoted. But we also learned that in terms of the chemical weapons, right, the second leg, if you will, of the WMD triad, that the analysts at WinPAC, who were the CW analysts, were skeptical. In fact, they were doing their job. They were basically saying, look, we've got procurement information, we've got satellite pictures, we've got we've got this informant information, but we don't have a smoking gun. And they were, quote, drifting. They were ambiguous. The information was ambiguous. And what happened was when they saw that the estimate coming in, the information coming in from the bioweapons side of the shop was really uncaveated whatsoever, high confidence, it gave these guys moxie, and they ramped up their belief, and so they went from moderate confidence to high confidence. Not because the information had changed, but because they basically said, well, geez, if Saddam's got bio, we know it's easier to produce chemical weapons than, anthrax, and he used to have this, enormous program back in the 1980s, so if he's got this huge bio program now, he must have a chemical weapons, and it sort of didn't get a lot tougher than that. So, and on the nuclear side, which is the INR caveat that you referred to, even by the time, if you go back again and you look, even by the time Powell is up at the UN, he's admitting the information is disputed, right? The question of aluminum tubes, and he says, I'm an old artillery officer, and I can't imagine why they would want these for artillery rockets. I mean, he's acknowledging that there are problems in that case. And a month later, right, Mohammed al-Baradei, the head of the International Atomic IAEA, Atomic Energy Agency, in Vienna, goes up to the UN Security Council, and he says flat out, we have been to all the sites, we've talked to all the people, we've looked at all the procurement records, and we don't see it. And not only that, but we have these documents that you've given us, meaning the so-called uranium from Niger, and they are, quote, not authentic, meaning forged. So for anyone watching, the nuclear leg had just collapsed. So that's sort of why I argue that, when we went to war, those of us who were watching closely, and I know many of you in the room were, there was no real nuclear fear at that point, certainly nothing imminent, but there very much was a biological and chemical. That's why they were wearing the suits, and so much of that we now know really hung on Curveball.
Yeah, I'm Charlie Clark, a journalist who follows this issue. I was just curious about the paper that Scooter Libby and Dick Cheney's staff wrote that Colin Powell took to the CIA. I assume has never been declassified, and wouldn't that be a sort of a smoking gun with lots of fanciful conjecture on the part of the administration?
Love to see it. Never come out. It hasn't come out. I'd love to see it. Yeah.
Has anybody tried to?
Oh, we all have. I'm sure. It's never come out.
In back. I'm Gareth Porter, also an independent journalist. And I'm really interested in the point you just made about high confidence and what that meant in the context of that particular estimate and that particular aspect of it. And I'm curious, and this goes back to an earlier question, or a variant of it, are there rules of any kind about what should constitute high confidence or medium to high confidence in regard to the type of evidence and the number of sources that should be the basis for such key judgments? Do you know? I mean,
yeah, there definitely
yeah.
is. I mean, in fact, if you look at yesterday's NIE, it actually defines what high confidence versus moderate versus. They have a whole page of sort of a scale of what these things are. And as I said before, the NIE, which is supposed to be the gold standard, is supposedly a very deliberative, consultative process in which drafts get passed back and forth from agency to agency, and they're sort of people lock themselves in a room and debate this and defend their positions and argue it out, and you wind up with footnotes and whatnot. I mean, one of the changes that in fact has occurred since 2002 is that if you look at the declassified key judgments from 2002, the ones that were published at the time and that were shared with members of Congress at the time, it simply had the high confidence stuff, right? This is what it is, this is what it is. It didn't have any of the caveat, it didn't have any of the footnotes, right, which is what you're referring to. We learned about those later. The new NIE, in fact, if you read in today's papers or go online and read the NIE, has the footnotes attached directly to the key judgments. If there are dissents, we know that the policymaker, and now in this case, because they declassified it, we know there are dissents of some of these key judgments, which we did not know in the past. So that has actually changed.
But just to clarify, I mean, my question really was, how would you explain the fact that they could get away with calling a judgment based on this single source, which, had been, in fact, questioned by some in the agency, a basis of high confidence when we know in the current NIE on Iran, it required, like 1,000 sources, according to the Washington Post story this morning, and months of, withstanding challenges to, whether this was somehow tainted by, being part of an Iranian
Well, what it said is 1,000 bits of information for the NIE.
Right,
It's not 1,000 sources.
I'm saying there's
Yeah.
it seems like there's an awfully big contrast here.
Yeah, there was. Again, Curveball is the principal source. It's not like that's it and they didn't have anything else. They found what they believed to be corroborating information, such as satellite pictures. And as I explained earlier, they discounted anything that was contradictory to them, such as the wall that was built. There are also, Powell in fact refers to this, 3 other sources at the time, one of whom, astonishingly enough, was already in the U.S. intelligence system as a known fabricator. That is, his file already existed as a fabricator. And there was a Defense Intelligence Agency division chief, I believe that's right, in the room with Powell that day when this information was being discussed. But again, because of this level of secrecy and his name is not being used, he claimed after the fact he didn't know they were talking about the same guy that he already knew was a liar. And this is one of Chalabi's guys. This is one of these people who I was referring to earlier as sort of the Zelig-like figures, who was just claiming all kinds of wild stories and saying it to the New York Times and Vanity Fair and 60 Minutes and everyone else. So they had what they believed at the time, by the time it reached up to the top level, what they were being told was corroborating information. When you went back and looked at it, you realized, in fact, none of those, even if you took them at face value, none of their stories jibed with what Curveball was saying. They had very different versions of events, and they were all sort of contradictory. But in any case, all 3 of them were subsequently proved to be fabricators.
We have 2 over here.
Yeah, Wolfgang Schaefer, Georgetown International. I have a question concerning the information which the BND gave to the CIA, because I understand that at the time this information about Curveball was transmitted to CIA, they already questioned very much the credibility of Curveball. If you could comment on that. And then I have a second question. How do you see the cooperation of the intelligence agents right now? Because I understand that some of the thwarted terrorist attacks in Europe, among them also one in Germany, was tipped off by the CIA.
Well, on the first question, you're absolutely right, and we broke that story in my newspaper in 2004, so, which is one of the reasons the story to me is so scandalous. The German authorities sent several warnings, both directly, including a letter directly from the head of the BND, August Hanning, to George Tenet, as well as indirectly through the station chief in Berlin, through the DIA office at a place called Munich House in Bogenhausen in Munich, and through a lunch from the BND station chief here in Washington, that were specific warnings about their doubts about Curveball, or at least their warnings that saying, we have not confirmed this information, you use it at your own peril. And in the warning that came up here was worse than that was we think he may be a fabricator. There are real problems with it. He's had a nervous breakdown. And the details, in fact, were quite strong. He had run away several times. They had tried to get him to move several times. He refused to go. He was very unstable. They were very concerned about his mental state. As for the current cooperation, it's my belief that one of the reasons I was, as I say, surprised to discover this tension level between the BND and the CIA in particular, that had gone all the way through the latter stages, through the whole Cold War, really, certainly the latter stages and up through the 1990s, was because I've always understood that, governments rise and fall, but basically spy services, operate at their own speed and they all have to cooperate with each other. I think in the 9/11 world that has increased on the terrorism issue, and the reluctance on the parts, where there are disputes, it's on tactics, not on sort of on the basic grounds of cooperation, on tactics like renditions, extraordinary renditions, and those kinds of things, where several of governments that in fact have gotten involved have really regretted that now. And you've had all these investigations. So I think, I mean, I don't have specifics on it, but certainly my impression is that the cooperation on terrorism issues is quite strong. And I believe the cooperation on Iran has been quite strong as well. You could argue that, in fact, French and German governments have been, if anything, as strong, if not in some cases stronger than the Bush administration has been on the Iranian nuclear, or what was seen to be as an Iranian nuclear weapons program and is now just known to be an Iranian nuclear civilian power program.
Hi, Shelton Williams, the Osgood Center. I have a two-part question as well. You said it's kind of a conflict between true believers on the one side who are sort of looking for things in intelligence, and intelligence folks sort of feeding what they might want to hear, but you keep coming back to Colin Powell, who was not a true believer. He was not a lone agent. He had INR. He had Lawrence Wilkerson, famous to this organization. How was he convinced to be the spokesperson for actually going to war? Well, and then the second part of it is, what are the repercussions for the analysts? I mean, I see the changes in how we do NIEs, but are the specific analysts and the specific folks who missed it so badly, were they in any way disciplined or sent back to school, or were there any consequences at all for them?
Well, George Tenet, got the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
I know. I started to say, did they all get medals or just one?
I mean, you could. I view this as, the worst intelligence failure in our history. I mean, there are lots of them out there, but I can't think of another one where we have, sacrificed so much blood, treasure, and credibility on chasing what really proved to be a delusion. So the answer is on the question of accountability. I'm not aware of any and it's sort of not the way that system works. You're supposed to give your best judgment, and you can't be penalized necessarily for being wrong. Where I fault them tremendously is that they held on to those bad judgments long after the information was coming in, and then they defended it by saying, well, trying to remember how he phrased this. Nobody else could have come up with a different judgment, so don't blame us just because we were wrong.
Everybody thought so.
Yeah. And there's a lot of truth to that, except to one degree. I covered the UN Security Council debates, or I hoped to so at the time, and the fact is that Saddam Hussein's government and Scott Ritter, who's in a separate category all the time, were really the only people saying that Saddam had no weapons of mass destruction. The French didn't say that, the Germans didn't say that, the Russians didn't say that. The problem was that there is a long line between the zero, proving that negative, the zero, and whatever that top end is, what Condi Rice or Dick Cheney would say, having a mushroom cloud is your smoking gun, or a smallpox weapon or something. There's capabilities, and there's intentions, and there's procurement, and there's infrastructure, and there's production, and there's staffing, and there's training, and there's stockpiles, and arsenals, and weaponization, and et cetera. And we were all the governments were somewhere on that line, but nobody was saying he had zero. The debate really was, what do you do about it, right? And the debate at the UN was, do you stiffen sanctions, or, stiffen inspections, or, keep up the no-fly zones, or what do we do? And the Bush administration and the Blair administration were saying, no, we go to war. That's sort of where that debate was. And I lost the last
And
part.
Colin Powell was where on
Yeah,
that
I mean, well,
line?
if you talk
How
to,
did you convince him?
if you talk to Colonel Wilkerson, he'll tell you he was convinced that day. I mean, that the curveball stuff was, quote, the strongest stuff, incontrovertible evidence. Now, I think Powell, he's not an intelligence officer. He's a user, as was Colonel Wilkerson. These are customers. It's not his job to. He's not the guy out there collecting intelligence. When he goes out to the CIA and the director of Central Intelligence and the deputy director and the heads of the, and members of the NIC are out there saying, this is the best stuff we got, he's going to say, and this is the NIE that, we've written it down, we've given it to Congress, he's going to say, okay, thank you, I'll take it to the bank. Now, at some point along the line, he obviously swallowed whatever doubts he had. And, history will judge whether he could have done more, whether he could have resigned or should have done something to stand up. He sort of has yet to sort of share that with us. He's, I guess, going to write a book, and then after the administration leaves office. But in my view, and I've talked to him about this. I mean, he was quite, I think, bitterly abused and misused in this case. They put him up there precisely because he was the most credible. In my view, credible person on the international stage. That's why they sent him up there, and that's why, and frankly, and it was his decision to ask George Tenet to sit at his shoulder behind him. He wanted that image. The CIA it's not just me saying this. This is the CIA standing up here or sitting behind me, and whatever. And as George Tenet wrote in his book, this was, quote, the last place he wanted to be.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that because this is, I confess to being a little, probably too unsympathetic to this kind of sort of sense that folks were used or that folks got bad intelligence, because in part it seems to me that policymakers have no right to perfect intelligence. I mean, that's just sort of the business. I mean, that's right. You get to be the leader of the free world precisely because you're thought that you can make sort of judgments even acting with imperfect information in a very complex world. And so, when you look at this kind of this curveball story, holding aside all of the partisan stuff, because I think your Mozambique story is a great example of the kind of politicizing of intelligence that isn't necessarily done with malicious intent, but just the incredible power and influence that the president and the people around him have to drive the process. As a consumer, a future consumer of intelligence who's just read this amazing story, I mean, what's your advice to future presidents and secretaries of state? Not to get suckered in, because I mean, ultimately, there's absolutely no guarantee that this is not going to happen again, right? And it's ultimately their call.
Well, no one's ever asked me to advise the president before. I'm sort of a little gobstruck up here. The subtitle on my book is Spies, Lies, and the Con Men Who Caused a War. I wrote that as a provocative term. It is we're all grown-ups here. The commander-in-chief is the one who decided to go to war. Saddam Hussein, was viewed as an imminent threat by this administration. That is a political judgment that they made, based on the faulty intelligence and based on their own view, especially after 9/11. The politics of it are sort of one side of this. To me, the scandal is whether George Bush made the right decision or the wrong decision. To me, you cannot make the right decision if you are not given accurate intelligence. And what's frightening about this case, to me, is that not just it was wrong on the edges, it was fundamentally wrong in every sentence. So whatever decision he makes on the basis of that is by its nature going to be a problematic decision. And one of the odd things about it, there's this great line out there, Bush lied, people died. And one of the curious things I find in this is that if you look at President Bush's statements as regards Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, not on 9/11, not on Al-Qaeda and all of that, but just on weapons of mass destruction, I've looked pretty carefully. I cannot find a single sentence that he said that creates any daylight whatsoever between what he's saying and what the CIA was telling him. So he is frightening all of us, right? He's driving the country towards war. Colin Powell goes up to the UN. The polls show an immediate change of view. He's also representing exactly what the CIA has told him. So to me, the scandal here, the frightening part is that so much of what they did on the ground level was so wrong, so that inevitably led to a policy decision that we're now living with.
Question over here.
But my mother thanks you for that question about advising the president. I just want you to know. Sorry.
This may be too far afield, but your story is fascinating of extreme action going to war.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, Bob Shadler. Extreme action, as in going to war based on extremely faulty intelligence. One sometimes speculates on extreme inaction based on good intelligence. And I don't know if you'd have any speculative thoughts on two things. One, the Sandy Berger attempt to destroy memos that seem to be related to 9/11. It seems plausible they were at least embarrassments to that administration. And then we hear about this August memo before 9/11 with the Bush administration, where with Tenet having his hair on fire and so forth. So just reading newspapers, one thinks there may have been good reason in both the Clinton and the Bush administration to do something related to 9/11, where both administrations chose not to. And I'm just wondering, the other side of being nervous is when the intelligence agencies come up with pretty reliable stuff, and the political judgment may be, let's punt or let's not do something. And I don't know if you have any thoughts. I have only speculations based on nothing.
My book is not obviously about the 9/11 period. I mean, the memo that came up, and I don't know I'm familiar with Sandy Berger incident, but I don't remember the details. But the memo, which was not speculative, it was a real memo that said Osama may strike in the U.S. or something, and it was in fact shared. But they get a lot of information out there, and it was picked out after the fact. And this is a fire hose of information that's coming in, and so after the fact, you can pull out a strand and say, this was a clear warning that they were given. Whether there was an appropriate time for them to have acted or whatever. I mean, one of the things that the 9/11 Commission concluded was when George Tenet was arguing, we declared war on Osama, and I was after him with all guns blazing, is he forgot to tell anybody. I mean, none of the other agencies. He was the DCI at the time, and again, this is not what my book is about. He was the ostensible commander-in-chief of the 16, or what there was then, I guess, 14 intelligence agencies, and if that was his priority, it didn't get communicated. Outside of a certain very small rank, and it didn't lead to any great reorganization or redirection of resources. So it's after the fact you can go back and look at it, but you have to sort of guide it against what the actions were.
Earlier we were talking about Beth, the CIA analyst who holds on to the mobile biological weapons trailer way too long, and you mentioned that one of the sort of great things about having written the book is that people have sort of come and talked to you after it. So, I mean, have you learned, what interesting things have you learned after the book? And, this sort of links into this question about, what happened to people? I mean, is Beth still in the CIA? Does she get a promotion? Does she get a demotion? I mean, it doesn't sound like, she shares office space with Jerry, which is kind of a bummer.
She, as best of my knowledge, she is still at the CIA. I was telling Jeffrey earlier that since the book came out in October, it has, I've heard from a number of people who've approached me independently or through others who want to share further information. And the way I've been describing it is I wrote a 300-page book about screw-ups. I could have written a 350-page book about screw-ups because it was, in some cases, it was worse than I thought. This is especially true on the German side, I might add. It turns out that there's quite a bit more that was done to sort of enable, I guess would be the term I would use, or facilitate his story and not be sufficiently rigorous in terms of checking that. I made 3 trips to Germany to try and find Curveball. 60 Minutes did a story that ran after my book appeared. They said they spent 2 years and, they didn't get to Curveball either. They got his name. I used one of the, in my book, I used one of the pseudonyms that he had used when he was in Germany. They put out his real name. It's the same guy. They got a video of him dancing from 1993. But the problem is, of course, he was a liar, and he has not recanted his story. And the challenge I found in trying to write this book, and as I'm getting more information about it, is I'm writing about a clandestine operation that takes place that involves a series of intelligence agencies. I'm writing about a lot of people who have a great incentive to cover their own butts. I'm writing about agencies in which, by definition, people are trained to lie, cheat, and steal. And I'm writing about an operation that revolves around a guy who's known to be a liar. So, sort of trying to weave my way through all of this and write this as a coherent narrative has been a challenge. I'm getting more information. Beth stays inside. Her sort of chief protagonist, Margaret, is now out. Margaret Hennick is her name. I've had a number of conversations. She's very entertaining. The leadership, for the most part, of the CIA has not entirely has changed, but the DCI and the deputies and the heads of the clandestine service and WINPAC have changed since then. So there's been some movement.
Okay, here, and then we'll go over to that.
What has happened to Curveball?
Ed, introduce yourself.
Bill Nell's name. What has happened to Curveball?
He lives in southern Germany. He's married. He has a son. He has a lawyer. He is under the protection of the German intelligence services. He has not spoken to members of the press. He is he's in the equivalent of a defector. He's in a defector protection program. It's the equivalent of a witness protection program. They have not made him available, nor have they chucked him out of the program. And the explanation I get for that goes through several ways of thinking. On one hand, they're saying, we never declared he was right, so we don't have to ever say he's wrong. That gives him a little bit of leeway. Right? We never vouched for him as such, so we never have to throw him out as a fabricator. And because we weren't in the Iraq survey group, because the Americans wouldn't let them in, they never actually got to the direct intelligence collection in Iraq that disproved his story to the degree that we were able to do, or the U.S., was able to do. Secondly, that there's a great fear that when you bring somebody into this kind of program, if you throw them out, it's going to send a very bad signal to other defectors, other informants, other people you're trying to get in. You do that at your peril. And thirdly, the way it's been described to me, under German law, if they were to bring him into this program, and that requires a great deal of paperwork in the German system, if they were suddenly to say he's a fabricator, then there are people, pensions are at stake, and people could be challenged. Well, how long did you know he was a fabricator? And if this is a problem, the longer this goes on, if they were to kick him out now, they're going to say, well, the Los Angeles Times declared him a fabricator in 2004. Where have you been? So he's still in there, and he's not talking.
We had a couple of questions. Oh, so this woman, then we'll go into the back.
Yes, I'm Nina Pfeiffer from GAO. This just seems like an example of incredible incompetence on the part of the CIA and a failure to essentially provide truth to power. And I just wondered in your investigation if you talked to anyone who said at the time, before the war, where they actually said, this doesn't add up, this is a problem, no one's listening to me, there's a lot of pressure from the higher up, so on and so forth.
Yeah,
I mean,
there was-
did people come forward?
Yes. Well, they didn't come. They came forward within in CIA. The chief of the European division and his chief deputy, the group chief for Germany, and their executive assistant, made a concerted and repeated effort to raise flags. This is what I was describing before about this issue of sort of who's credible and how you define that. And they wrote memos, they had meetings, there was a sort of a shouting match in front of John McLaughlin's executive officer. Tyler Drumheller literally went in and he was the group chief for, I'm sorry, the division chief for Europe, and tried to cut this material out of a draft of Powell's speech and sent that up through channels. There are a number of meetings that are documented in the Rob Silberman Commission report of people trying to do that, and they were ignored, they were put aside, they were told this isn't your problem. And as for the then head of the clandestine service, Jim Pavitt, there were discussions at his level, and he basically said, this isn't your problem, he's not our source. And his view at the time was we could tap dance, naked up and down on Pennsylvania Avenue, and it isn't going to stop the war. So let's focus on the other problems we've got here. After the fact, there's a lot of blame that goes around here, and it's not one person, it's not Beth or whatever. The German authorities take the point of view that the Americans, quote, sexed up the intelligence, that that they warned the CIA about these problems, and that when Powell was up there saying these things, it was not in fact what was in the German reports that had been given. This information had been transposed over time. The British blame MI6. There was a post-war, the Butler investigation in the Parliament. The head of the MI6 went up and he blamed the German authorities for mistranslating information that they were passing on and giving them false information that hyped the level of the threat. In particular, one of the things that made his information seem so dramatically raised its profile was this claim that they had put spray dryers on these trucks. That is, this ability to take a wet, slurry, gloppy, biological, soupy stuff and instead turn it into the stuff of like an asthma inhaler. So you get these clouds, and it obviously changes the nature of the threat in terms of, with the soupy stuff, you can shoot it at somebody, but basically unless it hits them on the head, it's not going to do a lot of damage. With this stuff, you can spray it out of airplanes or whatever, and it changed the nature of the threat. And they basically said that was just a misinterpretation or a mischaracterization of what it was, in fact, Curveball had said. But that wound up being in Colin Powell's speech, and it was very much in the British calculations before they were going to war. The CIA was having their own battle back and forth between the DO side and the DI side as to who was to blame on that, but by and large they at least publicly blamed the Germans for not making Curveball available, which was always a dodge on their part. And the Rob Silberman Commission and the Senate Intelligence Committee more broadly blamed a utter failure of management and utter failure of leadership, poor tradecraft, and they particularly all pointed the finger at something called the Defense Human Agency, which is part of the DIA, and which was sort of the front line. This was the group that was in Munich and was sort of the liaison between the BND and the CIA. And they had, what one of the investigators told me was a case of immaculate reception. That is, they took these German reports and they did no independent verification. They didn't do any vetting. They just put them up through channels, but because it was coming out from them, it seemed to have the imprimatur that this was reliable information. So by the time it gets up to CIA, to people like John McLaughlin looking at it, he's saying, well, obviously they must have checked this stuff, or why would it be landing on my desk? And in fact, it had never been done so. And the Rob Silberman pointed the finger for that at the Defense Human crowd. So there's sort of a lot of, he did it.
You mentioned the shouting match. You also mentioned earlier that was more ludicrous than you describe it in the book. Is that something you feel comfortable?
There's a chapter in the book about a particular showdown between the division chief for Germany, I'm sorry, the group chief for Germany from the clandestine service and the head of the bioweapons team from WinPAC. And it's being done at a meeting in front of the executive officer for the DDCI, John McLaughlin's XO. And and this goes on, and it's a real shouting, cursing match in which one of the arguments is the woman from WinPAC says, we've confirmed this information, and Margaret says, where did you confirm it? She says, well, it's on the internet, and Margaret says, in response, well, where do you think he got it from? And then Margaret has since told me that there's, at one point she said to her, and, we've got a picture of him in a hazmat suit. And Margaret's response was, how do you know it's him? It could be my grandmother, right? Somebody in a mask. And I'm just trying to remember, there was a third example she gave me, and I don't recall, but it's similar ludicrous kind of stuff that, if you believe it's true, then the information fits into your theory. If you're looking at it from a utterly, from a zero-sum point of view, if you're trying to look at it from an independent perspective, then it's fine. You're whispering something to me.
That's great. So, in the back.
My name is Jo Freeman. I'm a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm curious about Scott Ritter. How did he get it right when everyone else got it wrong?
Asked about Scott Ritter. As I think many of you know, Scott Ritter was a U.S. Marine who had worked had gone to the Soviet Union as part of a weapons inspection team after the Cold War, and was horrified to discover, as I think many people were, how much U.S. intelligence had missed, particularly on biological weapons. The Soviets had an enormous 60,000 people working in a biological weapons program that the U.S. intelligence had essentially missed until the Cold War, until the end of the Cold War. They got hints of it very late in the game when there were 2 or 3 very big defectors that came out. So Scott was part of that. So when he went to Iraq, he was the most gung-ho. He was, I believe he was the senior American on the ground in Iraq. I can't remember what his title was. And he was there for a number of years, and he became quite obsessed with trying to prove that trying to find Saddam's weapons programs, trying to find the proof. And in fact, he is the person who first, at least to my knowledge, came up with this theory that Saddam had biological weapons, mobile biological weapons facilities. He wrote a memo in '95 or so saying, we can't find Saddam's biological weapons. We know he had them, so therefore maybe they're on trucks. And so he launched raid after raid to find these trucks, and they'd get this information, and they'd go running over, and it'd be filled with construction material. And he proposed this idea that they would get helicopters to chase trucks down the road and spray foam to drive them off the side of the street and do that. And they got intelligence from the Israelis at one point that there was a fleet of ice cream trucks that were red and white striped ice cream trucks driving around, and that these were in fact hiding the weapons, and they stopped these trucks and they found ice cream. So Scott, and then as you know, in '98, Scott left UNSCOM in a very public and very bitter fight over what he then was claiming was the UN's unwillingness to challenge, and the United States more importantly, unwillingness to challenge Saddam over what he was at. What Scott was then claiming was clearly a defiance of the UN resolutions, and what he was convinced at the time were active weapons programs. Somewhere over the next 2 or 3 years, Scott had a astonishing change of heart, and it partly came because in 1998, after lobbying from Ahmed Chalabi and others, the U.S. Congress passed the policy of the United States was regime change in Iraq. And by the time we get to the run-up to the war, for whatever psychological reasons or that Scott can explain, and I've read it and I've talked to him a number of times, and I don't quite get it. He had flipped 180 degrees, and Scott even went to Baghdad, you may remember, before the war, and met with their parliament and sort of begged them, come clean, let the inspectors back in, give them everything they want. I know you don't have anything, and you don't, so you need to come clean on this. Scott's view after the war in fact, I called him at one point after one of these reports came out and said, "Hey, Scott, you must feel sort of vindicated. You were right." And he said, "No, this is all a tremendous cover-up." Scott lives in sort of these, he's one conspiracy down the road ahead of me at all times. I'm always impressed by this. I said, "Well, how is it a cover-up?" And he said, because it was regime change was always the policy, then that was the driving force, and everything that was done since then really has to be viewed in the light that it's all disinformation that was geared towards this achieving the policy of regime change. So that, in his view, the CIA knew all along there were no such weapons, and that the NIE and Curveball and all of that was all just a very elaborate disinformation, misinformation campaign to achieve the policy. Now, it's an interesting theory. I've never seen any proof whatsoever that supports that. But, pardon me?
What about Kamal, the nephew?
He was the brother-in-law, son-in-law. I can get into it, but let me just finish this. So Scott's point of view on this. He was very publicly saying Saddam had no weapons, but it was sort of from that particular background that he had. I guess the way I've described it, he was right, but sort of right for the wrong reasons, or at least in reasons that I have a hard time understanding.
There was another question in the back. I don't want to. I'm sorry. I don't want to come back a second time. I don't see. Oh, I'm sorry. I've been ignoring you for quite some time. I apologize.
To what degree do you...
Introduce yourself, please.
Sorry. Stuart Schwartzstein. To what degree do you think that what Khidr Hamza had to say was given credence by the intelligence community?
Khidr Hamza was the nuclear,
Yeah.
the bomb in my garden.
His book on Saddam's bomb.
Oh, Saddam's bomb, right, okay. I confused my defectors, yeah. He was, yeah, right. Khidr Hamza was, by the time he was brought up and, testified in Congress, he was fairly quickly discredited at a certain degree. That is, some of his information, it's not hard to track, that at a certain point along the line, and I don't recall the specifics, but that at a certain point along the line, he began speaking of things with certainty that he clearly could not have known, that he was sort of, as I was describing earlier, sort of the coin of the realm for defectors is to keep giving new information that's stronger, and he fit into that category. And his information, which again was only about the 1980s when there really was an effort to get a nuclear weapon, sort of was limited in scope and limited in his expertise, and he went very public with it, but it was sort of a part of a broader context. But I think he was not widely within the intelligence community, was not given credibility.
Two interesting things about that. There were a number of Iraqis who were out of Iraq by 2002, like Hussein Shahristani, who were well aware of the program that had existed, who said to me a few years ago, Hamza was best known for stealing air conditioners at Tuatha.
Right.
But the second thing was that he was given a senior appointment in the CPA.
Well, that's another issue. I mean, so was sons and daughters of but yeah.
We're out of time, sadly. But so I just wanted to give you. Is there anything sort of you wanted to say to wrap up, or you felt like you didn't get a chance to?
I will answer the question back there quickly on Hussein Kamal. Hussein Kamal was the son-in-law of Saddam Hussein, who in August of 2005 packed up his bags with $25 million in cash and took Saddam's daughter and his kids and his brother, who had married another of Saddam's daughter, and defected to Jordan. And over the next couple of months, in briefings with CIA and MI6 and certainly the UN weapons officers, Ralph Akeas, said, yes, we did have these weapons back in the 1990s, but we destroyed them all in 1991. And his defection led to a utter reevaluation of policy in Baghdad itself. For the first time, they began cooperating. They trucked all these thousands, millions of pages of documents to a chicken farm, and they said, Hussein Kamal hid these on his chicken farm or something. And it opened up new realms of information. And when I went to Baghdad after the war, and I was talking to some of the weapons scientists at the time, they said, in fact, what happened at that point was it really led to Saddam saying, we destroyed everything. Let's open up, give them everything. and this is the scientists telling me this, but by then they had destroyed so much of the evidence, and they had spun out so many lies in their attempts to mislead the inspectors all through that first 4 or 5 year period, that at that point they had no credibility whatsoever, and it was sort of, they were just, every time they told another version of the story, it was, yeah, well, we've heard this one, how are you going to prove this one? So in retrospect, the fact that when Hussein Kamal said, we destroyed everything and we have nothing, and then he went back to Iraq and was immediately killed, you would have thought it would have given somebody some pause that he might have been telling the truth, but it wasn't seen that way.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.